All righty, it is 2 o'clock on the nose. Welcome, everybody. This is We Matter, Art for People with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. It's your first breakout choice of our 2.5 day extravaganza, and I hope you've been having fun so far. I want to introduce you to Ross Edelstein. We're delighted to have him with us today. He's a student working on his PhD. He's worked at Edelstein. We're just thrilled. Before I get started, I want to take a second to go through a couple of items. First is that we ask that you stay muted during the course of the presentation, just so that we can keep everything focused and on Ross and his presentation. When we get to the end for questions and answers, then we can talk about other sorts of things. Feel free to use the chat along the way at any old point, and we can address it along the way, or we can address it at the end, depending on how it flows through the presentation. You can also, speaking of the chat, you can rename yourself if you want to give a different name or a pronoun or any of those sorts of things. Just hover over your image and you'll see 3 dots, click the 3 dots, and then you get a choice to rename and you can go from there. Captioning is also available in this session, and actually in every session. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there's something that says live transcription. If you click on that, it'll give you a choice of showing subtitles. And if you have any questions or of a tech variety during the course of the session, just do a private chat to Indiana Arts Commission. That's to Connie, who's our tech help today. And she'll see you right or get you to the right person, or we'll take care of all that sort of stuff. With that, I'm going to back away and let Ross do his thing. Have fun, everybody.
All right, hello. I'm going to go ahead and get my screen sharing at this point. Get all set up with that. So, hello everyone. As has been mentioned, I am Ross Edelstein, and today I'll be presenting We Matter, Art for People with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. So a little bit about my background, why I'm here, how I got to this point. So I have my master's in museum studies from IUPUI, and I'm currently working on my PhD in special education at IU. And through that, I'm also working an assistantship at the Epley Institute for Parks and Public Lands, which is part of the Indiana Institute for Disability and Community. There's a lot of nesting going on there. My work primarily looks at cultural special education. So things like, how do we make places of culture accessible? How do we make engaging with culture accessible? And that's everything from, as I mentioned, parks to museums, which is really my big focus area in terms of my personal research, to everything else. In the past, I have worked with the Children's Museum not as a staff member, but doing volunteer work, helping them develop things like their social narrative. I played a hand in getting Spike to wear a mask at the end of that. I have worked for the State Museum as well as with them on various projects for accessibility. And I had a internship as part of the museum studies program at the Edelstein Museum, where I did a lot of accessibility stuff there, developed things like social narratives and future activities to be ran when we're not so COVID-y. I also just realized I should probably give my visual description. I got out of order on my little script here. I am a mid-20s white man with dark brown hair and a recently trimmed beard, wearing a charcoal gray suit jacket, gray shirt, and a blue tie with golden State of Indiana symbols on it. And my background is the disability pride flag. But we have, getting back on track, back to my other experiences that have sort of led me to this point, because that's my professional side, but I also have personal experience. I'm someone with autism, and specifically related to this work, autism is a type of developmental disability, intellectual and developmental disabilities being the sort of big overarching category. So I've had a lot of experience with the arts throughout my life. My family has always had a strong belief that the arts are important. So I went to a lot of shows and concerts, as well as going to a whole lot of museums. And yet throughout all of this, I never really felt like it was for me. I never really felt like the work was being done in a way that was welcoming me, due to the differences that I've experienced in my life. And this has continued into adulthood. I love the arts. I love engaging with the arts. But as I've learned more about myself and my own disability, I've also discovered that there's been discrimination against me, both from the employer side. I've had organizations specifically, not in the exact words of "we're not hiring you for your disability," but I've seen people's faces change during interviews and knew that I wouldn't get the job when I mentioned my disability. I've also had experiences where I've been unintentionally discriminated against as a visitor due to the way that I need to accommodate myself, from things like, having to wear sunglasses inside, or wearing headphones, or having to have a bag full of various things that, maybe an art museum doesn't want you to have a bag of stuff on you. So this is both a research presentation, but also a very personal presentation, just like all of my work. I can't stop being disabled, so my work is inherently influenced by that. And that is really where we get to the sort of crux of all of this. That people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are often left out of the discourse and direction in the art world, particularly in terms of engaging with art. I apologize, I didn't want to cough in everyone's ear. And while this representation is improving, it is just as important for someone with an intellectual or developmental disability and their social and emotional well-being to be supported by arts institutions, arts organizations. So getting into some of the meat of this presentation, I'm going to start with some of the theoretical background of this, which comes from my master's in museum studies over at IUPUI, taking museums, health, and well-being fall 2020 with the wonderful Dr. Lois Silverman, which if anybody here has a chance to work with her, do it. She's awesome. So this really made clear the importance of museums as a whole, but also arts organizations in general, to health and well-being, and sort of helped create this idea, these ideas that I've ran with going through not only the second year of my master's, but also getting into my doctorate. So the first is that the therapeutic potential of museums as pathways to inclusion, which is by Dr. Silverman, as well as Mind, Body, and Spirit. These are both readings. How museums impact health and well-being really were central to a lot of this, and really provided this jumping off point to developing this idea of what I call of well-being that really is kind of like a triangle. You have your physical health and well-being, which is, not being sick, being relatively healthy based on whatever your baseline is, because it's different for every person, but also your social well-being. Are you engaging with other people? Are you feeling like you're valued by other people around you? Are you getting the supports you need? As well as cultural well-being, as a sort of third part of that triangle, which is more, am I engaging in activities and aspects of the world that make me feel fulfilled? Am I, able to go to a museum if I want to? Or for some people, it might be, can I go to a bar? Can I engage in these cultural resources that give me fulfillment? And sort of through this class kind of develop this idea that, well, wait a moment, a lot of people are sort of missing out on that cultural side of it. So getting into that from here, let's talk about intellectual and developmental disabilities. So this is a little bit more technical and more specific, but there's no real single definition of an intellectual and developmental disability because it's a very, very wide grouping. So what I like to use, and the one that I think is most applicable for us in the arts world, is this definition on your screen from the University of Minnesota Institute on Community Integration, which is a mouthful. That intellectual and developmental disabilities, IDDs, are disorders that are usually present at birth and that negatively affect the trajectory of the individual's physical, intellectual, and or emotional development. My apologies again. And so some examples are autism, behavioral disorders, brain injuries, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, fetal alcohol syndrome, intellectual disability as a sort of specific diagnosis, and spina bifida. And if you look at this list, all of these affect the way that people are able to interact with the world, be it from a more physical sense, but overall, the way that people think about and can mentally engage with the world. So we also have to talk a little bit about the models of disability. So there are two major models, two big schools of thought that are opposed to each other within this. So you have the medical model of disability, which essentially is disability is entirely medical. It is something that is inherently wrong with a person, and that person can be fixed. The other model is the social model, which essentially says that while disabilities may be caused by a difference within a person, so for example, my autism, or somebody having a mobility impairment, the way that society is built causes a lot of the issues that they experience. For example, job discrimination that I mentioned earlier, or the fact that a building has been unable to put in a wheelchair ramp, or somebody has just chosen not to. So this is this idea that, and most people don't fall entirely in one camp or another, and I fall between. However, in terms of the art world, art is inherently going to be more of that social model, because art is regardless of if it's just a single person engaging with it or a single person creating it, it's inherently social. It's inherently tied to the way that we view the world, both in creation and engagement. So let's talk about where people with disabilities really are in the art world as it stands. So a lot of the time, people with disabilities are left out or considered something special and different. A great example is and this is an article by Millett from 2008 called Alison Lapper Pregnant, about a statue of the same name that was displayed in Trafalgar Square as public art, and later became a sort of centerpiece of the Paralympics in London. And essentially that statue, Alison Lapper had a physical difference and was cast in marble, essentially, just like a sort of classical Greek statue, and then displayed very prominently. And it was this special thing. It was this, you know, wow, for the first time, a lot of people are seeing someone with a disability being portrayed as art. And so it really, and this was back in, I forget what year the actual statue went up, but it was the early 2000s. And then you also have the creation of art is also viewed as something special, as a special program or a special engagement or however. And this is really, this piece I use a lot. The Siege of the Cultural City is Underwear. Adolescents with developmental disabilities make art. I don't like the title, but the work that's in there is really, really good, because it basically explains that, you know, not just the effects of art programs for improving the way that people with disabilities engage with art, but also it really points out that, you know, these programs tend to be one time or special. And oftentimes when disability is talked about with art, from what I have seen, it's often looking at the physical representation and leaves out people with invisible disabilities. You can't look at me and say, oh yes, that person looks like he has autism, because that's not possible. And a lot of intellectual and developmental disabilities are invisible. And so, and also there's this infantilization that, you know, like I mentioned, the sort of scare quotes around art in that title of that piece, The Wexler, really points to the fact that in a lot of ways it's, yes, we're doing something very simple and not engaging with the fact that, you know, they can have these more complex ideas within art and engage with them. So moving into sort of the more importance of this, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities want cultural opportunities and often face significant barriers to getting them. And so sometimes they're physical, things like noise, lighting, signage, or the physical design of a place. But often it's a lack of understanding. You know, a lot of people haven't met someone with an intellectual or developmental disability and don't engage with someone who has an intellectual or developmental disability regularly. There's often also a lack of involvement with, like I said, you don't engage with someone regularly, you're not going to understand them, you're not going to understand their needs. And for something that in some ways can affect the very basics of how someone engages with the world, it can be really hard to overcome that barrier without actively working for it. And also there's a lot of lack of programs. Well, yeah, people with developmental disability, intellectual and developmental disabilities do need extra support, but that doesn't, and while it doesn't need to be, you know, always child focused or coded towards children, programs don't really exist in a lot of places. There's a lack particularly of really accessible ones, especially if you don't have a very severe impact from your disability. And the programs that exist tend to support people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I have a whole list of specific programs I've looked at, and there are, the most recent ones are 2021, so it's recent research, but I have here 5 studies that were just a very cursory search that say, hey, when there is art programming for people with disabilities, especially intellectual and developmental disabilities, they tend to have better well-being outcomes. And that, and it doesn't need to just be, you know, I'm going and creating an art thing. It needs to be all types of cultural engagement, all types of arts engagement, concerts, theater programs, museum programs. All of them showed the same results. So it is something that really, really is important for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and has been shown that, you know, it works, that it does actually improve outcomes. So getting into a few of the programs that exist, this is very brief. I am mostly familiar with the museum programs at the top, as well as others that do exist. And I have a number of friends in other arts capacities, other fields beyond museums, that I've asked for which ones are the ones that they think are the best. But a brief list of these programs. The first is the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which in a lot of this stuff is an outlier, and was doing this kind of programming far before anyone else. They have their Discoveries program, which is intended for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, helps a lot of people with autism, and it's essentially a tour of the museum, specialized tour, followed by a related art making program. So for example, you might be looking at, the use of the color blue, and then your art making program is about making something using the color blue to represent feelings or more general symbolization. That's been going on for a long time. And on the other side, in the more traditional museum sphere, the Smithsonian has also been a leader, as they tend to do, in running their Morning at the Museum program, which essentially has been a sensory-friendly time, usually with staff training and less sensory input from lights, sounds, etc., as well as it being a reserved time period. And it's been shown to be pretty effective. It's also primarily aimed at children. There are also a number of theater programs, and all of these, the Miracle Project, Action Play, Epic Players, and CoLab, are all focused on the engagement in theater. My apologies. All of them are about getting people to be actors. And while a lot of them are also focused specifically for autism, because a lot of the time when people talk about intellectual and developmental disabilities, it tends to either be autism or sort of traditional intellectual disabilities, which is another area I'll talk about a little bit. But even if they are, a lot of these are just generally for intellectual and developmental disabilities or disabilities in general in the theater programs. There are also sensory-friendly variants of symphony programs. So for example, the Boston Pops, Colorado Symphony, and the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra all offer sensory-friendly experiences. And those I'm not as familiar with, I will admit, but they are present, and they are primarily focused on making the traditional symphony experience more welcoming. This is also not an exhaustive list. There are programs that I don't know about because I'm one person, I only have 24 hours in a day, I can only learn so many programs that exist. But as I mentioned, a lot of these are also focused either they're broad or they're focused specifically on intellectual disability or autism. And that leaves out a lot of people with a lot of who do still need support. So moving into sort of where we're at as a field. So this is sort of a diagram that's about the sort of process of developing an intervention, and art programs, supported art programs, arts, or any sort of accessibility thing is really a type of intervention. So you have your sort of initial idea in that first block on the left, which is coming up with the idea for the intervention of, or support. You have clinical testing, which is that second block, which is testing the support or intervention in a highly controlled environment, and usually done by whoever came up with the idea in the first place. You also have small scale testing as the next step, which is a less controlled environment, but still with control and with the research team kind of there, and also done by actual field staff. Then you have large scale testing, which is something like, okay, we're going to kind of observe it, we're going to do research on it and give it a real world environment with the original team, and primarily looking at, okay, we know that this works, but is this being done in a way that actually works? And so when I talk about all of those different types of interventions and different types of supported programs having worked, that's sort of where we're looking at. We're looking at this point in between large scale testing, for example, those Smithsonian programs and the Met programs that have had research done on them. And we're right before the last step of full implementation of places of arts organizations are now adopting this on their own to implement at their organization without being approached by a university researcher saying, hey, I think that this program that I have in mind could run really well at your place. How about we put something together with that? And so we're really at this point where it's starting to happen, but it's slow going. And that's sort of what this presentation is. This is not necessarily as much, this is a specific program you can run. This is a call to action. This is find programs that work for your organization, because not every program is right for every organization. It's all about making these a change that's right for your context. So here's that call to action. Here is what I'm really looking for you to get out of this. Art education for people with disabilities in cultural organizations is the right thing to do. Whether it's making a symphony accessible, making a museum exhibit accessible, or offering a supported program. Design your programs and experiences with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. This is not just saying have them in mind when you're putting this together, but reach out to local artists who have intellectual and developmental disabilities. If you're doing an art program, reach out to local organizations that are self-advocates. Reach out to people with disabilities and find out what works for them and what sort of things they're looking to get out of the program, and develop your programs that way. Even your general programs. Employ people with intellectual and developmental disabilities at your organizations. This is a huge, like I mentioned, I face job discrimination, and I'm presenting at this conference. I'm someone who is getting a PhD, and yet my disability has still caused me discrimination in employment. Being aware that people with disabilities are just as capable as people without disabilities of having a job, especially in the case of intellectual and developmental disabilities, is incredibly important. And finally, make your organizations welcoming for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We live in a world that is not designed for us with intellectual and developmental disabilities. A world where when I go, I have to plan to visit a museum or plan, and it has to be really the only thing that I do in a day if I'm going to a concert, where I don't know if going to a certain event is going to cause me to be overstimulated and, worst case scenario, have a meltdown. Working to make sure that your organization is one that someone can feel comfortable when they visit. And whether this is offering programs that are intended to be more specifically designed for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, as well as offering the chance to maybe training your staff, or however is best for your organization, because it has to be for your organization. There's no right answer. Make your organization welcoming, because so often the world is not welcoming for us. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions and stop sharing so I can see everyone. I see that there's a lot going on in the chat, so I'm going to respond to some of these. So this is people who have been.
If you scroll down toward the bottom, Ross, there are a couple. Maybe why don't, while you're looking, one of them is, what kind of visual arts programming have you seen for children with Down syndrome?
So I haven't seen a lot of that in particular. I know that it exists. As far as I know, I haven't seen a whole lot here in Indiana, which again, a lot of my context is going through IUPUI museum studies during a pandemic. And I know that there are programs for children with Down syndrome. And if you're more interested in that, just look, I'll have my contact information, send me an email. I can find some more information on that, because I'm curious too. Because as I mentioned, intellectual and developmental disabilities tend to really be focused on either intellectual disability, because that's the first thing people hear, or developmental or autism, because it's kind of, the big fancy, everybody knows about it, everybody's heard about it, everyone's been made aware of it sort of deal. And so other programs don't exactly get the same sort of spotlight in terms of research.
There was another question. Go ahead. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
And going into I just wanted to talk about the mention of the verbiage of it and models being more inclusive. I agree. The thing is that one of the issues is that the needs of every person with disability is a single person with a disability. My experience is going to be different than some of the people that I know who are also advocates who have disabilities. So and that's just within autism. That's just within being an autistic person. The problem is that while programs should be designed to be inclusive for all, there's always going to be people as well who need that special experience, who need a supported experience, like I mentioned. And that is, and while I think that every program that is put together should be aware of it, if, for example, your guests have identified a need for bringing in that a lot of people with autism want to visit, but don't feel comfortable visiting, and so you offer a specific program for that group, that's providing that extra support. And it should still have all disabilities in mind when you're putting it together. But if I'm, for example, developing a program that's, we're going to do a fancy cheese and art making night, that I'm not going to try and aim that at someone who's lactose intolerant. That's not how I'm going to sell it. And so I think it again depends on what is the point of your program. Is it for a particular group? Because that's okay. Just don't forget to include all people with disabilities in it. So hopefully that sort of answers that. I'm open to any questions. If anyone wants to use the hand raise feature so that you can actually talk in the chat, or feels more comfortable putting it in the chat, I'm more than happy to answer whatever.
And you can pop your mic open and put your screen on too if you want to actually engage. That works too.
Yeah, if you want to if anyone wants to put on their video, go ahead and do so. It's nice to be able to put a face to a person. And you don't have to. I'm not trying to force anyone to be on video that doesn't want to, but yeah.
Ross, from my perspective, you've been looking at this for a while. What's the most hopeful thing that you've seen that folks are trying to do?
The most hopeful thing I've seen is the fact that in a lot of cases, a lot of programs are now being developed, including people with disabilities in that development process. So as I mentioned, I've done some volunteer work for the Children's Museum, and I've been a part of their advisory work. And that is done not just, with, yes, somebody who has a PhD and is an expert on this, but someone with lived experience too, and someone who has actually experienced this and can say, well, hold on a moment. Yes, there might be research that says this, but is that necessarily right for your organization or my needs? So that's what's been really helpful for me, is that, and it's not just, with me doing it, but with other organizations that I've interacted with. The Met, for example, has an advisory board of their own, and I am aware of a lot of organizations that do that as well. Hopefully.
And in fact, there you go, Aaron, please. You want to turn off? There you go. There you go.
Hello.
Hi. So with all of this being said, because that was my question about more inclusive verbiage, we as an arts organization are kind of the umbrella over the producing organization. So we have our resident companies, and we have other companies throughout town that rent our facilities. So we in ourselves are not a producing organization. So I want to understand, how do we bring that type of, because we do have producing organizations using, ASL interpreters and trying a sensory friendly type program. However, it's, you know, most of them are still in that stage where it's not solid. And I'm wondering, as an organization who, like I said, again, just rent spaces and whatnot, how do we facilitate perhaps some kind of an education to producing organizations and how to better develop this programming?
That's a really good question, because that, I think, also affects, you know, because in your particular case, it's especially important, but even in, you know, say a museum or in any organization where it might not be the people at the very top who are creating whatever programming exists, it's create opportunities for people to learn about this stuff. Because there are a lot of people who are curious about this. I think that's why everyone here is that everyone is here, rather. Everyone here is curious about how they can be better. And I also want to say everyone here is part of the solution because you are here. The thing is that there are people who don't think that they can be part of the solution, don't necessarily think that they can access these resources, or might just feel that they're too busy to do so. So making convenient opportunities for example, saying, hey, we're going to offer a training in general, and we're going to bring in X, Y, or Z organization or X, Y, or Z person, because there are lots of people who do this sort of stuff and who are also disabled. And we're going to bring in people to help sort of explain this and offer it as in your case, since you don't have direct control over people, it would be, you know, more of here is a chance to sign up for this. And maybe, you know, you offer it at no additional cost, so that it doesn't feel like, yes, but I have to pay for this to find this information out. But in cases of organizations where you have direct control over the people who are creating programs, have it as mandatory training. And I will also share that there is a training coming out soon. I'll put the sort of soon trademark. Don't really know how long it's going to take. Out of the Kennedy Center for arts administrators engaging with people to make organizations welcoming for people with neurodiverse disabilities. So that's another one of those big fancy words that has come out lately that really isn't really well defined. Autism, ADHD, there are a few other groups within it, but it's something that I was a part of putting together with the Kennedy Center with a few other self-advocates, as well as other researchers, and some of the people at the Smithsonian helped with it too. So it's really cool. But having, say, yes, that is an opportunity that if you're interested in this, we can offer up a chance to get this, or if you're interested, let us know, we'll let you get into this. So I don't know how the Kennedy Center is going to price that. They don't tell me that sort of stuff. But yeah. And just wanting to highlight what Adam put in the chat. Partnerships. They're talking about the Northeast Indiana Disability Advocacy Coalition, which has a lack of generalized arts participation. And sort of even going off of that, there is an organization here that I have had some contact with. Pandemic kind of messed with that, called Self Advocates of Indiana, which doesn't do a whole lot of art stuff, but they do a whole lot of advocacy, and they do offer trainings, they do offer chances to do that. it's a really good group. It's done through ARC, which is a more generalized advocacy organization, which also is a good group to reach out to. But it's a but that's a really good one. And so even going off that as well, it all depends on, they're also, depending on what you're looking at, what age you're looking at your programs as well. This is separate and a little bit off topic from the question. There is as I mentioned, the Indiana Institute on Disability and Community, which is it's a whole bunch of things that are big fancy definitions, but basically it's partially federally funded. They offer trainings for engaging with different types of disabilities. So they have an early childhood center. They have a transition from school to adulthood center, and things like that can offer a lot of resources, and the various centers also know better who to talk to in terms of people in the community. So that might be another good place to look for specific resources as well. And I see Adam also has his hand up. Hello, Adam. What question do you have?
Hi. So I'm with Audiences Unlimited, and we've worked to develop a lot of new programming, particularly theater and whatnot. Aaron knows us well. So one of the things I've always struggled with is we're very good at putting together equitable practices for individuals who are interested in joining chorus, theater as performers. But I think I've found, and in my academic research as well, I've struggled to find people or struggled to find programs that are helping to help on the more technical end of all of our arts work. And I think it's because financially it becomes just even more cumbersome and harder to do. Do you find that to be a national issue, or have you seen programs that are really good at helping develop lighting designers? Or, a lighting design is a perfect one because it's so practical in all forms of art.
So, yes, it's a national issue. A lot of the programs I mentioned do look at other areas. And so those might be, places to reach out to. But it is a major issue because, again, this is one of the big problems with all disability related things. And it's why, I've mentioned before that, things have to happen for adults too, because despite what all the money and funding for these programs says, I haven't stopped being autistic. It didn't stop when I turned 18 or 21, depending on jurisdiction. Yet the services and support and the money for people to create these dries up. So that's part of it. And it's also that, and that's because kids are easier to justify and easier to say, look, this is a thing. But that's also true with things like lighting and sound. It's harder to get someone hooked on the idea of, I want to fund this equitable lighting program, than it is about anything else. And in some cases, it can happen accidentally too. My youngest brother is deaf, lowercase d, has a cochlear implant and a hearing aid. And despite the fact that he should have probably been put on the lighting board in my high school's theater, he was put on the soundboard and did a really good job with that. Went to all state for theater from his sound design. And so it's entirely possible. But the problem is that it's not as easy to justify this, because again, when you look at, and this gets into sort of the broader history of disability, if you look at a lot of advocacy movements, they're focused around kids. ARC, and if anyone is uncomfortable with old versions of medical definitions for certain disabilities. Please plug your ears now, but ARC used to be called the Association for Retarded Children. They are not that anymore. They've changed their name to just ARC, and they do wonderful stuff. But it was focused, it's that children portion that is so that, you know, that's where the money goes. And it's the things that are really cool and flashy that's easy to sell it on. When the reality is, you know, I just need a space to have a map that tells me where I can have a little bit of quiet if I'm going to a museum. I don't necessarily need a full room, even though I've actually presented on that topic too. But it's something that it's really easy. That's kind of the point of this, is that unless you're doing something flashy, you have to really fight. And it's national, it's cross, it's intersectional, it's everything. Yeah. Any other questions that anyone has?
Go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, the intersectionality statement you made there, Ross, just it really gave me another question. Do you see this becoming a greater issue too once you add other minority groupings on top of it? Are you really seeing that? Yeah.
Yep. No. Yep. You say no more. The answer is yes. If you, for example, if you have autism, you're already more likely to have a bad police encounter, as an example. Combine that with the fact that there's also an underdiagnosis of certain disabilities, and in some cases overdiagnosis of others within Black, Brown, LGBTQ, it's every other sort of marginalized status. You're already going to have poor outcomes. I'm lucky. I grew up in St. Louis County, which has the special school district, which is a separate sort of special ed system that provided services instead of having to compete with my own school district. I also grew up in a very high socioeconomic area that was able to provide me the resources to succeed. And I'm also lucky that I'm less impacted by my disability than other people. So I've been able to, you know, get to the point where I'm here. I also am aware that I have had such incredible luck in getting to this point because there are so many people who don't have the chance to say, oh yes, I am going to go to a museum in the first place. And I want to do art outside of the classroom, and will never get that support. And so when you talk about, you know, one of the big issues, again, in disability representation is in a lot of cases, it tends to be very whitewashed or done in very white ways, very high socioeconomic leaning ways as well. And so you're absolutely right. Like, because if you're already at a disadvantage, you're not going to even know if there are free programs that exist to help you.
And I think related to that is something I worry about in this setting and every other is, you know, the panacea, the sense that we feel better because we say, well, here's the number they can call if they need accommodation, or, you know, here's where they can find information on the website. They just have to call, they just have to ask, and they you know, have whatever they want. Is that inclusive?
No. Let's start with the website, because that is, I have been on a crusade against some website related stuff lately. A lot of websites are inaccessible, and that's a whole separate topic. But a lot of museums will also say, oh yes, we have an accessibility section and our website's not super accessible, but we've gone to this outside contractor and that's going to make it accessible, when the reality is, and if anyone's interested in this, I've got the research, I've got the documentation. It doesn't. And it actually can cause more lawsuits for being inaccessible. And websites are legally mandated to be accessible under the ADA. And so it's a common shortcut that a lot of places take. The other part is that you might offer a list of things, but then your email that you offer or phone number isn't necessarily somebody who's been trained on what you have. So I've ran into a lot of issues where a website says, oh yes, this is our accessibility email, and then it reroutes to customer service, and customer service doesn't know what I'm talking about. And I'm like, and doesn't know who to ask in the museum. So it slows down the response, but it also makes it so that, you know, by the time that I finally hear back, if I'm visiting, from the visitor perspective, I might not want to visit. I might not want to do whatever program you have. And offering, and again, it's also fine to have a phone number, but are you offering, you know, TTY, which is offers accessibility for people with visual impairments, and offering, you know, other options that can make it so that I can actually get the information, and just having, oh yes, this is who you contact. There's also a lot of people, as I mentioned, the social model, who don't want to be discriminated against and feel like if they have to reach out to somebody, they're going to be viewed as causing a problem. And people with disabilities just want to be people. So again, having as much information on your website so that you don't have to do that is great. An actually really good example of doing that is the Edelstein. They recently put up a website, that web page that really clearly states what they offer. It still needs to be updated and whatnot, because of new programs that are incoming and things that they've done and whatever. But yeah, that's a really good question, because that's a big part of it. And the other part is clarity, because as I mentioned, intellectual and developmental disabilities inherently affect the way that you perceive the world, not necessarily just the way that you engage with something like art, but how you gather information, how you absorb new information. And so having something not very clear, for example, new game, Far Cry 6, wonderful game, work of art, in my opinion, had an accessibility page at the very beginning. Before you did anything else, you had to do accessibility. Had a list of presets, but didn't explain what was affected by that. And so even if, you know, some of them might have helped me, I didn't really need any of them. I didn't know what I was getting into, so I didn't want to click it, let alone someone who doesn't understand what the phrase cognitive preset means in the first place. So I has never encountered that before. So
I tell you what, Ross and company, what a wonderful hour together. I'm so sorry to say that time is upon us, but time is upon us.
All right, I'm going to share a quick contact information slide while you finish.
There you go. There you go.
So yeah, and thank you everyone for coming. This has been wonderful. I've really enjoyed this. And if you want to reach out to me, I have my email, r.edelstein@iu.edu, and you can find me on LinkedIn just searching my name, Ross Edelstein. That email spelling, just again, is REDELSTE, the @ symbol, iu.edu.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ross. And thank you everybody else. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the day and tomorrow.